Okay, I'm extremely excited and honoured for this one, as I've been kindly invited over to the East London flat of someone who has been a stalwart of the house music scene for over 3 decades. A man that, as a founder of Defected Records, has been responsible for introducing great house music to all of us, as well as throwing a few legendary parties and events along the way. It is my pleasure to welcome Simon Dunmore to the House Culture Podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, Matt. So how are you?
Yeah, I'm all good, thank you. I'm really glad to hear that. We always like to start at the very beginning on this show. So can you tell us where you grew up and how you first discovered a love of music?
I was born in Northampton in the 60s, in the Midlands of the UK, for those outside of the UK that unaware of where Northampton is, and lived there for the first 12 years of my life. Mm-hmm. Whilst I was there, I remember quite vividly getting reasonably obsessive about certain records. I used to buy a magazine. Oh God, what is the name of it? Anyway, it used to have all the lyrics of records that were in the charts at the time, and I remember listening to the radio and reading this magazine, and at that time, I think the acts that were in the mainstream that I really kind of were drawn into was Slade, very loud, kind of in-your-face kind of band.
Yeah.
Records like Come On Feel the Noise, like real kind of like stirring glam rock anthems.
Yeah.
And there were acts like T-Rex and David Bowie, and acts that had kind of like real charisma and real like really image-led bands, especially like Bowie and stuff, and that kind of got me obsessed with music at a really, really young age.
Mm-hmm. And so what kind of things were you into, like buying? Where did you have to own this music as well at that young age?
Yeah, I mean, when you're super young, especially during the late 60s and early 70s, you don't have a lot of expendable income, and so you have to buy your music. And I'd get my pocket money. I'd probably save up, or my mum and dad would occasionally treat me to a record, or so I remember going to shops and buying my records, and then being really important to me. I had an uncle that was really into Motown.
Yeah.
So I had access to some records, and you'd borrow records, and I hope I looked after them. I can't remember too well, but that's how your kind of obsession with collecting and certain labels and the importance of music in your life. Yeah. The fact that you can align certain periods of your life to certain records, and I think that's what I take from those early years in Northampton. And when I was 12, we moved to West London.
So at that stage as well, what impact did that have on you in terms of your musical taste? Because that's a real jump in terms of London. It's a massive melting pot, especially during that era. What influence did that have on your taste, if anything?
I think that if I'd have probably stayed in Northampton, we probably wouldn't be here having this conversation now, and it is pretty as simple as that. It just gave me access to easy access to going into town, easy influenced by everything that was going around you, and music was very tribal in those times. So you would be able to identify or see somebody and know what music they're into, whether it be a Teddy Boy or a punk or a rocker or a mod or a soul boy, and I think that kind of identity that somebody took on alongside that showed how passionate they were about the music that was important to them, and it was a badge of honour to dress in a certain way. Much missed, I think, in these times. I was exposed to that, and obviously you don't really realise the effect it has on you when you're in the moment, and certainly when you're so young. But I now realise how much of an influence it had on me, and growing up in those times.
So what tribes did you find yourself aligning with from that point?
I've made no secret of the fact that I was a rockabilly in my early days, and I used to go to rockabilly clubs and collect records, and I'd like acts like very obscure acts like Matt Curtis and Charlie Feathers, and they're kind of almost like a hybrid between rock and roll and country singers from back in the day. And like early Elvis records on Sun recordings and stuff. So the fact that I can actually remember those names and and identify as Elvis, and he probably his best records being on Sun, just shows how much it sunk in at the time, really.
And do you still own any of their?
Oh, good God, no. Long gone. I think I sold them to a collector. I think I moved on. Being a youngster and being quite fickle and moving between genres and being influenced by your environment and whatever. I moved on and sold them. They, it's quite weird actually. If I listen to them now, I wonder whether I would. I think I probably would still quite like them actually.
Well, maybe it's something to get back into. You mentioned West London as a young man. You worked in the Disco and Record Centre in Rayners Lane. How did that come about? Why did you want to work in that type of environment?
During this period, I always collected records. I'd listen to pirate radio stations, particularly Solar FM and Bob Jones, and he'd play records, and then I'd find them. I'd go dig in. There were mail order clubs, so you could get lists from them, and then you'd phone someone up and say this record's still available, and then you'd receive it through the post, and so I started to collect records, and it was not about the obvious records. It was all about those records that I could say to my friends, do you know about this record? I've got the original. I've got the 7, probably early days of 12 inches or sometimes album cuts and whatever. And I would end up compiling cassettes, which I would then copy and give to friends that I liked. Sometimes it would be a calling card as an introduction. I'd take them to venues and say, look, this is the music I play and I represent. Can I DJ at your establishment? One of the earliest memories I had of that was there was a wine bar in Hillingdon called Hiccups, which was kind of pretty close to where I lived in Uxbridge in West London. And I went in and said, what was your worst night? And they said, Monday. We don't even open on Monday. So I said, okay, if you open on Mondays and I can fill the venue, can I have 20% of the bar? And they were just like, yeah, but you're never going to fill it. But I filled it. And it ended up being like a go-to place for people that loved soul, disco, rare groove. And then from that destination, we would organise coach trips into London to Nicky Holloway's Special Branch, or you'd go and see, a Norman Jay gig, or any event in London. Clubs finished at 2:00 then, so you'd have a start-off point, and it wouldn't be that nights kind of drifted away to a few stragglers on the dance floor. It ended on a real high. Everyone would get back on the coach, and it was the start of a real community in West London. So I ended up getting a reputation and DJing quite frequently, and to get records to be more accessible to me and to get them earlier. It made sense to work in a record store.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and that working in that store, and it's we can talk about generally how I feel that those were kind of the meeting places, and that's been somewhat lost in the kind of digital age that we live in now. Put us behind the counter there for your experience. What was a typical day like, and what were the type of people coming in the door that you were serving?
You spent Monday to Thursday getting ready for the weekend, basically. All of the action, all of the clientele was Thursday evening, Friday, Saturday. So you would go through what had sold, what had become made available. You'd make your orders, according to what you think or you thought would sell. And then what would happen on a Thursday is the imports would arrive from the States. So vans would go to the airports, they'd collect the new releases, they'd drive to your shop, they'd have literally boxes of records, and you'd go through, you'd take a selection, you go in and you dip through them in the store, and then you go back to the van and say, I'll have 10 of those, 20 of those, if you were really bullish, 50 of a record, etc. And then you'd bring them in, you would have racks for the DJs that came in on a regular basis, so you would put the records in the rack of the DJ according to whether you thought he would like it or not. And that's, to earn the trust of your clientele was a really important thing. So you had to understand their taste, where they were DJing, what time they were DJing, what they may like, and even back then records were an expensive investment,
especially with imports as well.
Especially as an import, and then sometimes you'd get promos, and you get a box of promos, and you'd give people a record for free just because they were a valued customer, etc. But then DJs and people that were enthusiasts and collectors and whatever, they would all meet at certain times. Everyone has their habits, and as you say, it was a community aspect. And I saw it when we first started Defected, and we opened. We deliberately chose our office to be opposite Black Market Records in Diablo Street, because we knew there was going to be traffic of lots of very influential DJs, and especially DJs that were coming over from the States, and that community aspect of everything that I think I've been involved with is really important. So, but working in a record store. Actually going to clubs as a rockabilly, doing my events at wine bars, they're all about different levels of community.
Absolutely. And this period was in the 80s.
This was at the very start of the kind of acid house movement. So this was like back end of 87, 88.
Yeah. And that was my next question. What was your first exposure to this new thing called house music that was bleeding through from Chicago, imports, all those types of things?
I think with most things, you don't really realise that you're being exposed to a movement. Gradually, you become more and more aware of certain sounds and certain producers and certain labels. I remember. Records like Farley Jack Master Funk, Love Can't Turn Around, or Steve Silk Hurley, being played in clubs before anyone really kind of knew they were house records. And then all of a sudden there's a collection of these records that are, a little bit more up tempo, all four to the floor. All kind of made with new technology, and again, you're not really aware that it's new technology. I mean, the early adopters of producers in the studio, all kind of gravitated towards, drum machines and syncopated beats, and so. But it wasn't really until obviously the well-known story of Nicky Holloway and Paul Oakenfold and Johnny Walker going to Ibiza and then bringing back their experience from Amnesia and Alfredo and obviously the association with ecstasy, etc., and the explosion of acid house. That's really when it took hold. And and I know there's much debate between Manchester and London as where it happened first. I think it probably happened at a similar time. But it was just like an explosion. It was like a bomb going off culturally. It's like I had a flatmate at the time who was what we would call a casual or a dresser, and he spent all of his time buying, Batwegian loafers or Farrah trousers or Pringle jumpers, and he was really well preened and whatever. And he went from being so preoccupied with his look to wearing a boiler suit with "out of control" written on the arm and a bandana, and literally overnight. And that's probably the best example of not just him, literally hundreds of my friends being, having a similar experience. And it was a little confusing for me, if I'm honest. I was a soul boy. I loved my soul music. And there were great house records with soulful content at the time, and I probably related to them more. things like CC Rogers Sunday or Blaze Records and
Yeah.
and stuff. But so I wasn't really into the kind of extreme assets. Some Balearic records I loved, some records less so. But it was undeniable.
Yeah.
It was like punk rock. It was a cultural shift in the UK kind of music scene.
Yeah, and it's still burning bright as well. Punk rock, it kind of had its moment, and we've spoken to so many people on this podcast, and always the overarching theme around that type of era is that this movement almost was born a bit from punk, because it became this kind of DIY movement. People were buying these drum machines or whatever and using them for something that wasn't necessarily supposed to be used for, and they were putting on their own parties, just breaking into places and things like that. It had a real kind of can-do spirit that punk kind of had as well.
Yeah, I think that certainly in the early days, like with the warehouse parties, like you've just described, I mean, and they existed in like in the Rare Groove days. I mean, Norman Jay would and Judge Jules would find a warehouse and set up a sound system and then distribute flyers, and they were definitely illegal. And Judge Jules is called Judge Jules because he had a legal degree, and he would be the one that negotiated with the police when they turned up to try and close the party down. And so that kind of ethos existed before. It just became much bigger and far more extensive. I mean, the Rare Groove scene and and the soul scene back then was definitely not as broad in its appeal in terms of its numbers as the house scene was, and I think the house scene just took it to another level with the M25 orbital parties and partying in the fields, watching the sun come up, and they were raw and radical and adventurous times for a lot of people. Yeah. Pre-internet, probably pre-mobile phones. Yeah. So the stories about people gathering around a phone box and waiting for a phone call, and you had to have a community of people that were really connected and invested in to be involved in a scene like that. Now everyone just puts everything up on the internet and kind of hopes and prays everyone comes, but back then you'd have to do you'd have a mailing list. You may have to write out postcards or write out addresses on the back of flyers and stick stamps on them and go to the post office, and it was a completely different dynamic.
Absolutely. I mean, it's like I'm just thinking about trying to explain to my children about how you would go somewhere and hope that your friends who you'd organised with on the phone just turn up. It's like these days it's kind of a terrifying concept to actually turn up on a wing and a prayer, and it's been organised a couple of weeks ago and these parties are happening.
Yeah, it was they were probably, you probably had a greater connection with those people. You would probably have phone numbers. There were people that would organise little groups of people, so they would be your first ports of call, and you would hope that they would rally their troops and everyone would descend and come down. And I think that once like anything now, if you get a reputation for giving people a great experience, the key to that is then they go home and they tell their friends, and then they tell their friends, and then they tell their friends, and that's how everything should grow. So the key to, I don't think that has changed now. If you over-deliver, then the chances of people returning and being part of, I think that when we were our best at Defected, we never sold anything. We would say, putting on a party. These are the DJs. These are the records that they make. The crowds are really welcoming, friendly crowd. Come and join us. Yeah. It was never like you need to buy a ticket. It was etc. Or the first tier set up, putting people under psychological pressure to buy the next tier or the next tier. It was just come join us.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I want to move through the eras as well. So we've talked about Rainer's Lane, and then you went on to work at Cool Tempo in club promotions. What did that role involve? What was your day-to-day there?
I, when I was working at Rainer's Lane, met pretty much all the club promotions managers for all of the major labels and all of the independents, and got to know them really well. And one of them, a guy called Steve Wolfe, worked at Cool Tempo, and he offered me a job to be his club promotions assistant. And that job entailed managing a database of probably 1,500, 2,000 DJs. UK based. We would sign records. The promos would come in. You would mail maybe about 800 records. So you would physically have to put. I mean, you would have help, obviously. Yeah. You would identify the people that you felt would support those records. You would mail them the copy, and then you would phone them and say, "Great if you can play it.
Yeah.
Amazing if you can play it, but could you please chart it when your chart return to Record Mirror and Mixmag, because they were the Bibles for most DJs and most record stores and for specialist shows and Radio 1 playlists and whatever. So if you was in the top 3 of the Record Mirror Club chart, it actually meant quite a lot. So you would phone people and ask them to chart your records highly in their chart. The charts would then be sent off to James Hamilton at Record Mirror. He would then compile the top 100 on a weekly basis. And that was my job, to get the records as high as they could possibly go in the chart. So, and again, if you had the trust of people, because you were sending them, anyone can promote great records. Promoting a great record is easy, yeah. It's just like you send a record, they love it, they play it, they chart it. It's the records that are not so good that they sit on the fence about, that they needed persuading in terms of they needed to support them. That's where you really earn your money.
Yeah.
And I guess... I guess I did a pretty good job.
Yeah, you're almost being a tastemaker behind. Everyone looks at a DJ as a tastemaker. You're almost the tastemaker behind the tastemaker, saying, "I feel that this one should be something that you should be playing."
Sure. So, and that actually is how my job evolved at Cool Tempo. So, what I would do is I would still go record shopping at the weekend, or I'd still go out to clubs, and I'd still hear certain records. So I would then go to my A&R boss, a guy called Ken Grunbaum, or Steve Wolfe, and I would say, "Look, there's this record out there. It's coming on import. It's available to license in the UK. If you sign this, I'll smash it at a club for you. I know who's going to play this record. I know how to promote this record." And that's what happened. And we signed records like Elias, Follow Me, or River Ocean, Love and Happiness, I promoted them. They did really well, and then because they did well, I then eventually got asked to be A&R at Cool Tempo Records.
Yeah, amazing. And you were involved in getting remixes commissioned by American artists as well at that point. I'm thinking Masters at Work.
Yeah, there's a lot of acts actually. There was Shara Nelson, who was a singer for Massive Attack. There was a diva. There was an act called Innocence. Kenny Thomas. I worked Gangstar. I worked Arrested Development. It wasn't just house music. It was way broader than that. And then if a record was a soul record, then we would try and get a house remix, or if a record was a house record, maybe we'd try and get a more down tempo mix and whatever. The whole point of remixes is not to replicate the audience you already have; it's to broaden out the audience. And I see so many remix packages now, actually even back then, where literally the remix was catering for exactly the same audience and the same DJ as the original. Yeah. Absolutely pointless exercise. Yeah. Unless you got really lucky and it just took it to another level. But the art of remixing records is a science that some people don't quite understand.
Yeah, and you had a hand in remixing. So you were a part of Touchdown Productions with Steve McCutcheon. At this point, obviously, you're DJing as well, but you've approached almost, it seems like, a lot of the business side also. Was there ever a moment where you wanted to get more into production and that was kind of floating your boat?
There was a moment. I felt that sometimes I could hear things in records, and I went in the studio to try and get the record into a place where it would work on a dance floor. And if I'm honest, I would just plagiarise my heroes. I'd listen to a Frankie Knuckles record, or I'd listen to a Masters at Work record, or a CJ McIntosh record, or a Roger Sanchez record, and I'd try and get close to matching those. I mean, I failed. I mean, it was like I would listen to a Masters at Work record come in and just go, "Oh my God, this is just genius!" And so rather than just try and replicate the greats of the time, and not get close. You know, I just felt that really wasn't going to be my future. I'd rather them. I just decided that I would rather promote great records than try and fail to make great records.
Yeah.
And in hindsight, it turns out to be the best decision. I think I'm really good about shouting about things that I love.
Yeah.
And if you shout loud and people trust you and they trust your judgment and your taste, they tend to listen and believe in you. So it's consistency, I think, is the key. And I've consistently loved my house and my soul music for 35 years now.
Yeah, of course. And so in '94, you then got a role running the dance department at AM/PM. Big tracks for me from that era. I remember things like Alcatraz, Give Me Love, and Hella and I always say Fella and Harley, but it's Hella and Farley, Ultra Flavour. Obviously Alcatraz in particular brought in from Yoshitoshi. What was your process in terms of deciding which tracks to pursue and sign? How consciously in touch were you with your own ears and confidence in terms of
I
choosing?
think that I've always viewed myself as a mirror image of the audience. Mm-hmm. I feel that, if I'm listening to a record, would I buy it? I mean, as a punter, would you buy it? Yeah. If you buy it, is it part of? If you bought it, buy it. Sorry, my English is terrible. If you bought it, would you keep it? Is it part of a collection? Is it part of a label that they're called completists now, where you have to have every version of a record that South Soul has done, or whatever. So would you rack it? Would you keep it? If you're working in a store, would you be able to sell it? If you were a DJ, would you play it? If you're a radio DJ, would it? So you had certain criteria that you would go, yeah, that ticks that box, that ticks that box. If you ticked all the boxes, you knew that the record, okay, there's something going on with this record, then maybe you should sign it. But just looking back at those times, again, channeling things that were inspirations to me, A&M just wanted to be, AM/PM and Defected in its early years just wanted to be Strictly Rhythm. Yeah, I mean, that was my go-to label, and that was the balance of what they did at Strictly Rhythm, from putting out underground house records like Morel's Grooves or Master at Work, Love and Happiness to Alternate 3 and I Like to Move It. They had real balance. All of the people that dig out record labels because they have a commercial record and like, why are you signing that record? The commercial records pay the bills. Yeah. They allow you to indulge yourselves. They allow you to sign the records that are probably truer to your heart, and whatever. It's economics, and the people that don't have that balance invariably go out of business. Yeah. And so when I was at AM/PM, again, it was about balance of we'd sign record by Love Tribe called Stand Up. We just had Roger Sanchez, produced by E-Smooth out of Chicago, total underground record. And then we'd have, which was me indulging myself, E-Smooth did Deja Vu, great soulful house record, again me indulging myself, but we balanced that out by having Alternate 3 or Moose T Horny, and that kept my managing director and the head of finance happy, and I could indulge myself as long as as long as we had hits at the same time. Yeah. So that was really the ethos of AM/PM, to have musical consistency, to become a collectible label, and to have balance in what we do. And Alternate 3 and Horny, I still hear them out today, so they've stood the test of time.
They totally have. It's interesting you mentioned Strictly Rhythm. We've spoken to Gladys Pizarro on this podcast as well, and she's given us the deep dive in terms of co-founding that label. It's a very clear consistency message that she echoed what you're saying on that interview. In terms of you signing records at that point, how competitive was it in amongst the market of other labels?
Majorly competitive. I mean, the music industry is, always has been majorly competitive, and I think that there's two ways you can trade. Really, you can trade by having a big budget and a checkbook and paying people lots of money, or you can trade by being credible and people wanting to be associated with what you do, and that has real currency. So, I think if you don't have credibility, you have to pay. Most people that sign to the major labels, there's no credibility there. They sign there and they go there because they want to get paid, and then they hope and they pray that the major label is going to pay them enough attention to give them enough traction for them to become established artists. But I don't know what the percentage is of artists that fail, but it's probably something like 97, 98%. Yeah. Very few artists make it. Mm-hmm. And it's a numbers game for the majors. Yeah. And when you sign to them, you play the numbers game, and the number is you get paid. At an independent, you have to fight so much harder to get visibility and traction, etc. And normally that comes if you run a good independent business, you have consistency and you have credibility, and people want to be associated with that. So you're trading in a completely different way. You're saying, I'll sign your record. I don't have the money to compete with the majors, so I'm not going to give you that kind of deal. It's impossible for me to do so. But what I can do is I can give you credibility and I can give you profile, and from that, you may get new fans, you may get more gigs, you may be it's a shop window for other labels. I think it's really hard to sign people exclusively and control their lives and their musical output. I don't think that is a good way for independents to go. I think that you have to pick the moments and the records that you're really passionate about, and then you put your hand up, and then you hope you have a good enough relationship with people that they trust you and they trust you to put their music out, promote their music. Mm-hmm. You have to work really, really hard for that. Yeah. So that's the other currency. So, and that is really, even though AMPM was a major label and we did have a checkbook, I still viewed it as my money. If we needed to go into battle financially, we had that clout and we had that capability. But it was always about wanting to be part of, a body of work that was meaningful to a genre of music, house music. So
yeah, and then excuse me, and then moving on from there, it was in 1999 that you went on to found Defected Records. What inspired that decision and that move from AMPM to there?
That was primarily because when you work for a big corporation, you're not really in control of your destiny or policies or etc. And I was working at A&M, which was owned by Polygram. Polygram got bought by Universal. Universal merged A&M with Island Records. So it was they invited me to go work at Island Records. It wasn't an environment that I was used to. A lot of my friends had got made redundant. It just made me think that, okay, so at this moment in time, I've been offered a new job, but when the next shake-up comes, maybe, I'll be surplus to requirements and I won't get to keep my job. So to have a long-term career in the music industry, I felt I needed to be controller, master of my own destiny. Yeah. And the only way that I could really do that was to start my own label. And, you live or you die by the decisions that you make, and it just gives you an edge, and it makes you think about everything, and gets your adrenaline going, and a lot of people have done similar things, or a lot of people have started their businesses and their labels, and very few manage to make a long-term success of it. Mm-hmm. The thing that I think when I left, I'd ran a dance department, so I'd signed records and I'd overseen promotion, etc. So I was like, I know how to run a dance business. This is going to be easy. And then you start your business, and then you realise you may know something about the music industry, but you know very little about business and everything and the responsibilities that come along with that. So initially it was about having a long-term vision in terms of me staying involved in the music industry, and turned out to be the best decision I ever made.
Absolutely, bet on yourself.
Bet on yourself, yeah.
Indeed. So in terms of Defected, you've kind of taken us through a little bit of the ethos of the label. Where did the name Defected come from? What was the feeling behind that?
It's. I actually now realise how important and how lucky I was to come up with the right name.
Mm-hmm.
Me and my wife discuss this quite a lot. We have slightly different views on it. She thinks she came up with the name, which she did actually in a kind of roundabout way. So couldn't think of a name, was kicking it around for probably a good couple of months, having sleepless nights about it. One night I woke up at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, couldn't sleep, thinking about what am I going to call this bloody label and starting, and time was ticking. I picked up a dictionary, started thumbing through, just looking at random words and stuff. And I woke my wife up, who was working at the time, and she said, "Turn the light out. You're defective." And I was just like, "Oh, defective? I can't call it defective because it means broken, but I really like the word defected." Mm-hmm. And there were, it was a good play on words because it meant something that was broken, it wasn't quite right, etc. But it also, and that kind of appealed to the kind of irony. There was a T-shirt range at the time called Fucked,
yeah.
F-U-C-T, and again, it was a bit cheeky to wear a T-shirt with that on it and whatever. So I don't know, it just got my mind thinking in a certain way. And then of course, it meant to leave somewhere to go somewhere else. I was leaving a major label to start up my own label, so it fitted in a really perfect way. And then when you wrote it down, starts with DE, ends with ED, mm-hmm. So it was a nice rounded name. Once we got to the designers, a guy called Scott Parker, who worked for Ministry of Sound, actually, he designed the logo, did a great job. It just looked really strong and robust as a name on a record label and on a T-shirt, and again, it was really lucky. It was, if my boys now they're thinking about starting their own label, and I would say to them, like, you have to think about, will it work on a sticker? Will it work on a record label? Will it work on a T-shirt, on as a logo? If you're doing an event, it has to work across the board in all your mediums. Mm-hmm. For it to truly resonate. Yeah. So and Defected just ticked all the boxes.
Yeah, like you say, it's very, very pleasing. I can understand how pleasing that is. That my brain works very much in that sense. I want to talk about the branding. It's very uniform. Those original sleeves with the cut-off corners. Instantly recognisable. And you've just explained really how important that is. That it works across the board.
So the cut-off sleeve was, the sleeves, there's something wrong with the sleeve. It said it's corner cut off. But the other thing that did was it made it stand out when it was on the shelf. Yeah. It was, if you rack your records by the spine, there's this little kind of like uniform gap that means that it stands out amongst. If you're thumbing through your records, you can quickly go to the Defected record. So again, it was just about identifying, how people collect and search and their music.
Yeah. It's funny you say that, actually. I was flicking through my vinyl yesterday in preparation for this, looking for the Defected records, and I was scanning for that cut-off corner in amongst all of the vertical facing.
The downside of it was really expensive to manufacture. So
it's kind of that Blue Monday moment, isn't it, where the sleeve costs a lot of money because it's got these things cut out of it. You tasted immediate success. You first released Soul Searchers, I Can't Get Enough. Got into the top 10 of the UK charts. Did this reassure you that things were going to be okay, or was it worrisome that you'd set the bar so high so early?
I think that we were really fortunate. We had a lot of goodwill. People recognised why I'd left AMPM and Polygram, and they, people like to support the underdog and people that take chances, etc. And we had a lot of goodwill from the specialist radio side of things, and I think that's always your first port of call. When you're promoting records. So we'd heard Soul Searcher Can't Get Enough come in as an import. I loved the track. I could hear it getting played out. I could see the DJs that were supporting it. I had a great relationship with Brian Tappert and Mark Pomeroy. I called them and said, look, I'd love this to be our first record. I think we can get radio on it, but it needs a song. You've got a great chorus. It needs a song. And I remember very vividly Mark Pomeroy calling me up and singing to me the lyrics that he'd written. And he said, I've got this singer, Thea Austin. She's the singer from Snap. Mm-hmm. Snap, obviously, big records with Rhythm as a Dancer and The Power and stuff. So we had a bit of a story there, and I loved the song. So we released it. It was our first release, and it did set the tone. The great thing about when you start your business is you've got no baggage. You're just you've got nothing holding you back. You've got no, rent worries or staff worries or, VAT forms or tax returns or all the admin that just kind of like clogs you up when, so you're just doing all of the good stuff, speaking to DJs, trying to persuade them how important it is as a new independent label that they support this record. Mm-hmm. And they did support it, and that was a real catalyst, because once we'd had that success as an independent, all the labels that maybe had just wanted to see how we were going to do, whether they had reservations about signing to us because we were an independent, we put a record in the top 10. All those kind of misconceptions went away, and everybody wanted to sign their music to us. So I think, in the first year we had Masters at Work to Be in Love, we had Paul Johnson Get Down, again, just records that are still played in these times.
I was about to say that as well. And we was talking about success. We've spoken to Roger Sanchez on this podcast, and we talked about Another Chance. He does do a brilliant impression of you on that.
Does he?
On that as well, just to let you know. Obviously that got to number one in the UK charts. I mean, that's that's the first number one.
First number one, and it was the last record he made for his album. I mean. He played me his album, and I was just like, it just needs one more track, maybe something that's a bit more DJ orientated, a bit more clubby. He probably says it more in a Simon Dunmore-esque way than I do, but it was the last. And again, I remember going to the to Home, which was in Leicester Square, a club that doesn't exist anymore, to seeing Roger play and him playing it, and the first time anyone had ever heard that record, and he got a great reaction. So
it's all gonna happen and come together. I mean, looking back at that huge Defected catalogue that now exists, what records are you most proud of to have released under that banner?
It's almost an impossibility to choose. I mean, records that I personally love, normally the more soulful end, just because of my long-standing love of soul music. Can You Stand Hallelujah Anyway? A record that really shouldn't work on the dance floor. When we signed it, we just signed a song, and we were really lucky that Lars delivered an amazing record. And I remember getting that record and was DJing at Pasha that night, and I was like, I've got to find a way of playing this record. I think playing records as a DJ is a little bit like playing snooker. Sometimes you need to be 4 or 5 balls ahead, knowing that you're going to get onto the black at some point or whatever. And so I literally took the tempo down, took the vibe down, played this record, enjoyed that moment, got a great reaction. That made my night. When you're DJing, if the crowd drives you and leads you, you invariably don't feel as good as when you take the crowd on the journey that you want them to. And that night, I remember, I definitely took them on my journey to get to play this record that was so important to me. Storm Queen, Look Right Through, again, the original. MK made it an anthem and eventually a record that got to number one. But for me, the original song is just an amazing song, and the story of how that song came to be with Morgan Geist is an amazing story. There's a record by Guti with Luca Bacchetti, and it's called Finale, which has got a sample in it. I've no idea where the sample is from, but again, it just breaks down. It's got these amazing piano chords and this great soulful vocal. Didn't do absolutely anything at the time. Hasn't really streamed very well, but it's a personal favourite. It's all very easy it would be easy for me to say Cola. It would be easy for me to say, Bob Sinclair records, I Feel For You and whatever. Everyone knows about those records. But it's it's having love for your children that need it most. I think that comes to mind when I'm selecting records. Some of my favourite records are the James Brown records, because they're from Detroit and they're a gospel outfit, and the vocals and the lyrics are amazing. The Vision, Heaven, a record that I think stands up against almost any disco record, and you can play it alongside, a Leroy Burgess or it just fits, very authentic in its sound. Those kind of records are important to me.
And you've mentioned obviously ones there that aren't necessarily, you've mentioned some of the big anthems that would have been easy for you to say, like you said. But in terms of that indulging yourself, were there any things that you were signing or really fighting for internally that you knew it was going to do something, but maybe there was a bit of pushback and you released and it maybe proved the doubters wrong? Were there any like that?
No, I think that. I had a team of people. I mean, let's be honest. It's just, the strength of the label comes down from the artists that you work with and you collaborate with. Motown is a great name and a great label and reputation, but the strength of Motown is Stevie Wonder, Diana Ross, Marvin Gaye, Temptations. I mean, the label of all labels. So we don't even get close to that, and I'm not claiming that we do, but the strength of Defected within the house music world is the labels and the music that it's released, and then also the staff that you employ. I mean, some of the staff that we employed were as important as some of the artists that we signed. Really great at doing their job, really passionate, made things happen, my job was to lead them and give them a consistent vision in where we wanted to go as a label. I mean, they all used to moan that I used to say no to quite a lot of stuff, and it wasn't no because it wasn't a good idea. It was just no because we just needed to keep on track. And keep in our lane and keep in our channel and not dilute our energies by trying to do too much. And it's a bit like you say, you've talked about community and you've talked about consistency. It's about putting that team in place and then building that consistency, which then will breed the success that you've had. And also, going back to what I was saying earlier about the balance, it's I don't think when people look at Strictly Rhythm that they necessarily put I Like to Move It at the top of their Strictly Rhythm kind of like top 10. In the same way as when they look at Defected, they don't put End or Pump It Up as a top, and people have their views on that. A great record for the label for many reasons, not for credibility, but when we needed cash to pay 50 staff or to pay royalties or to keep the business fluid, it served an amazing purpose for us. So
and what would you say are ones that got away in terms of signing? Are there any ones that you're in the running for but got signed by a competitor, or ones that you wished you had released after you heard someone?
I funny enough, 2 records that I should have signed that I didn't for whatever reason. I eventually signed when the rights became available. Major labels, when they sign records, normally sign it for a term, 10 or 15 years. So I eventually did sign the Shapeshifters' Lola's Theme, and I eventually did sign Spiller Groove Jet, both of which I think I passed on when they initially came out. Sometimes you just don't hear things, and it's just depending on you don't align yourself to them, or you're not in a good mood, or something's going on and you're distracted. And I just didn't hear those records. And arguably, if I had signed them, neither record would have got to number one. I mean, Positiva did a great job on those records. They both got to number one. They're both still played now. They're iconic records. And I have good relationships with both producers. And when they became available, once the term had ended, they were quite happy to sign them to me at Defected. And that, and again, that just shows, even when you don't work with someone and you've got no skin in the game, if you can still have a great relationship with people, you can still respect people, and they can still look at what you do and understand and respect what you do. So long-term relationships, I think, is another key element to being successful in the music industry.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very relationship-based business, and it is that community behind the scenes that everyone knows each other, and everyone's moved around and worked in different places. It's very, very much like the industry that I work in as a day job. You presided over the label during some tumultuous times in terms of change, in terms of like the vinyl to digital to streaming, those types of things. How did the economics change during that period in terms of going from printing up 3,000 records to then nowadays where it's putting it onto a streaming platform?
I think that you just have to be aware of the environment that you're residing in, and understand how things are going to change. But you have to identify that earlier than the general public. When the general public is ready for a new format or a new way of consuming music, you have had to make those changes ahead of the game and be ready for them. If you move too early, sometimes that really adversely affects your cash flow and causes you problems. If you move too late, then your competitors are going to get ahead of the curve, and you're going to have another kind of pressure. So as an independent, and cash flow being a really big factor in us being able to survive, we would do monthly management meetings, monthly P&Ls, and we would monitor sales. When we were doing physical, we'd monitor returns. We'd make sure we'd press ambitiously but not recklessly. The worst thing about pressing 5,000 records is great if you sell all 5,000, but if you don't and you get 3,500 of them back and there's nothing to do with them, you have to write that stock off, and that takes a record from being profitable into being not profitable. You have to monitor all of these things. So what happened with Napster and file sharing was that we noticed a decline in sales pretty quickly. So once can be just a bit of a dip. 2 months in a row, you're like, what's going on here? 3 months, right, we need to do something about this. So in times like that, I believe that a business should really cut itself back to the core, focus on the real key elements that drive the business, not take too many chances, don't overexpose yourself financially, etc. And by doing that really quickly, and as an independent, we can make a decision and action it pretty much overnight. We managed to survive it. And then obviously, the majors all ganged up on Napster, and and forced it to stop operating and whatever. But out of that came downloads and iTunes, etc. And actually that worked really, really well for us, because everyone that complains about digital music and the fact that the music industry isn't the same as it used to be, and that returns, you don't get as much of a return financially and whatever. Yes, you don't get as much of a return financially, but the costs are so minimal next to having to manufacture CDs and manufacture vinyl and the storage of vinyl and the shipping of vinyl and all of the returns. If you put a record out on a digital format and it doesn't sell, it doesn't sell. You're not left with 10, 20, 30,000 pounds worth of costs. You just move on to the next thing really quickly. So yes, the costs the return is less, but the costs are relatively, negligible next to that. Plus, digital is a store that's opened 24/7, 365 globally.
Yeah.
We never used to sell records in Argentina, Chile, South Africa, Kenya, Russia, Serbia, Morocco, all of these places where we could not ship our records to. All of a sudden, there's people in those countries buying our music.
Yeah.
So what we saw was that was the beginning of our global community. That was the beginning of househeads all over the world being able to buy records, and those records being popular in regions that we previously had no access to.
Yeah.
And the great thing for the DJs and the producers, they then got to tour in those regions because they had profile and they had awareness, etc.
Yeah.
So digital opened up so many doors. And also, when you promote something in an analog way, in a physical way, a street poster or an ad in a magazine or a commercial on a radio, they're moments in time. When the poster comes down, it's not there anymore. If you create an asset digitally, it's online forever.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you have longevity, you have a greater connectivity. So the new world and the new order of the internet took away, but it gave back in so many, many more positive ways, I feel.
Yeah.
And you just had to understand that.
Yeah, and like you say, that first mover advantage, and also, people can go back easily and discover music that's, not in circulation anymore physically. It was so hard to do that.
Sure, and records that are relatively obscure that you wouldn't manufacture, and if you don't manufacture, no one's going to stock them. Like you say, you can go stream them, you can go download them. They're just there. So, records that weren't generating any income whatsoever, all of a sudden, were generated. It may be an insignificant amount of money, but when you've got a catalogue of 20,000 records, those little insignificant amounts accumulate to a meaningful number.
Absolutely.
And that's the beauty of having a catalogue, and that's the beauty of streaming. And you have to understand that. It ended up being a game changer for Defected, actually.
Yeah, and we're talking about diversification. Defected over time has moved into events in Ibiza, festivals in places like Croatia. We've kind of touched on it a bit, but obviously, what drove that need to diversify outside of just putting records out as a label, becoming a real brand and an events space?
The events, first of all, came out of the fact that radio stopped supporting underground dance music. Radio started to be really driven by advertising, and for the radio stations to realise their value in terms of advertising, they need their audience to stay engaged with them. So there's a time that people listen to a radio before they switch on to the next station, or they put their own playlist on and whatever, and that time dictates how much they can generate revenue-wise with the people that advertise on the station. So they play familiar records to keep their audience engaged. And by playing familiar records, it means they don't support new music. And we needed radio stations to support our new releases, which they stopped doing. So a reaction to that was, well, if we're not going to get heard on the radio, we need to go get out on the road and just get in front of people. That was our initial objective for it. What we then realised, being out on the road was real. Okay. So if and it was the early days of people filming and sharing their experiences, not on mobile phones. I mean, we had people going around with camcorders. Yeah. We would upload that footage. We'd do a monthly magazine, which we put out on video magazine, which we put out on YouTube, called Clubland Adventures. We'd go to clubs. We'd film the reaction to Ministers de la Funk Believe, or a Bob Sinclair record, or whatever, and then people would see that, and that actually became our marketing.
Yeah. But
it was real marketing because it was a real DJ playing it, and it was a real audience, and it was, it's obviously content on the internet now it's an overly crowded marketplace, but back then we were one of the first people doing it, and it created a enormously positive effect on the business. Again, it just kind of served to bring our audience and our community together. And and FOMO is a pretty powerful emotion in people. Do you know what I mean? The fear of missing out. I wish I'd be there. I'm not going to miss out next time. Yeah. I'm going to buy a ticket. Yeah. So all of this kind of activity fed into each other. Yeah. And the events went from being a promotional exercise and a marketing exercise for us into being a content provider for us, really in the early days, and I'm going back 12 or 12 years. Yeah. That content made our label really aspirational for the producers that wanted to be on the label, for the promoters that wanted to book the events, and they all served to help us grow our brand and help us sell records.
Yeah. Ultimately the main aim. Want to talk about, obviously it's 2024 now, it's 2022, you've kind of stepped away from the business of Defected. We were talking a little bit before the mics came on about how you feel like you've had that, it's 2 years hence, you've had those moments, and now it's time to kind of come out of your shell a little bit more and re-engage out there. What prompted that? Why was the timing right at that point for you to step away from Defected? And how involved are you still currently, if at all?
How involved am I?
Currently, if at all, with
I'm not involved in. I haven't been involved in Defected for almost 2 years now. Mm-hmm. I mean, I initially started when I sold the business. The intention was to carry on as a consultant. Mm-hmm. But I think for a label to succeed, it needs to have the vision of the person at the top, and Wes Saunders is now owner and CEO of the label. It really needs to be his vision. Yeah. And I didn't want it to kind of get in the way and compromise his his strategies, basically. Yeah. And I do think that the world has changed quite radically, and I think that for Defected to succeed in the way that he wants it to succeed, he needed to make certain changes. It's quite difficult being the man in the business and in the scene, and then literally, the next day your phone stops ringing, you stop getting emails. You don't wake up with a purpose. Mm-hmm. You wake up and you go, what am I going to do today? You have to find a new rhythm. You have to recalibrate yourself. It's a little bit of a jolt psychologically, and you go from thinking, because everybody has an ego, thinking that you're very relevant and very important to a lot of people, to not being relevant and not being quite as important as what you think you are. So I kind of I've had to come to terms with that, and in all honesty, it took a while. But now I just I'm finding I'm getting out and about. I have a love for. I'm trying to learn about art. Mm-hmm. And collecting art, art that I can align myself with. So it's normally, I'm quite obsessed with New York in the 80s, musically, the Paradise Garage, Larry Levan, all the music was played and made during those times. Mm-hmm. And obviously that extends to your Keith Harrins and your Andy Warhols and your, and then I'm finding out about artists like Richard Hambleton, who's a precursor to both, to Basquiat and Harrin and whatever. So, finding out about his works and stuff, and then understanding, same as music, is it collectible? Why is it collectible? Why do people relate to this piece more than they relate to that piece and stuff? And so that's occupied quite a lot of my time. I've been travelling. Mm-hmm. My family. My daughter still works at Defected. She works in events. And my boys want to DJ and they want to produce. My youngest is just completing his production course at Point Blank. Hopefully he'll get his degree. My eldest runs his own label called Sondella in the Afro House world. He's doing very well. So gradually I'm filling my time with things where I think I can be of use to people. I'm quite keen to mentor some people that I feel I can give guidance to, and the benefit of my experience. I think that the world has moved so far and so fast that a lot of traditional pillars of music production or DJing have been forgotten and left behind. And I think there's a big gap in the market. I think that it's great if it works for you. You know what you're doing, and you know you're great on social media, and you know you've got a great TikTok following, and fantastic. But for all those that don't have that, they need to put some solid foundations to their business in place. Nobody seems to want to do that. Everybody kind of goes for the, you know, there's no foreplay anymore. It's just like, so you know, I think you know, I'm a traditional guy. I come from traditional times and I have traditional values. I do think that they're missing. It's not about being old school and, you know, it's not as good as it was back in my time and whatever. I'm not saying that in it. I'm just saying that some of those disciplines are much needed in today's world. So that's how I'm feeling. That's how I'm filling my time.
Well, that's great, and you know, like you just mentioned as well, like fundamentally, getting the basics right will give you that foundation to move forward. Sure,
and you know, and we talked about your podcast actually before we started, and what number did you say you were at?
You'll
now?
be number 70.
I'm number, and you know, when you started your podcast, like when you start a label, or when you're going, shall I do a YouTube channel or whatever, everyone starts at zero. Defected, you know, they've got 1.3 million followers on Instagram now. They started at zero. So don't use the fact that somebody else is doing so much better than you as an excuse not to start if something that you truly believe in. So it's I'm slowly finding my fire again.
That's great to hear. Before we move on to talk about your choices for our perfect playlist, you know, I just want to touch briefly on, we're obviously sat in amongst an amazing array of vinyl here. You know, and I've seen on your stories and things, you've recently spent some time kind of organising this, managing it, you know, and you ran a competition where you gave some of it away kind of very altruistically. You know, how do you manage such a big collection of vinyl? Do you feel it weighs you down, or are you happy to have it all?
It weighs me down, and I'm happy to have it. It's just one of those things. You know, one of the things that's happened to me definitely during since my departure from Defected, I've found myself going back to things that kind of made me fall in love with music. So when I played my last set at Printworks, I played an all vinyl set. The reason I did that was because I wanted to remind myself of why I started DJing and how I used to DJ. It would have been very easy to play everything that I played in a digital format, etc. But you have to work really hard when you play vinyl, and it gives you an adrenaline rush, and it gives you a real focus when you're playing. Because the digital's not doing all the work, or you can't get yourself out of trouble. If you're messing it up, you've got to deal with it really quick. You know, I really enjoyed that experience, and I've really enjoyed going to record stores and buying records and being a completist and looking at the gaps in my collection, etc. I have way too many records than I could possibly need or play in my life. And I think that's, you know, I don't think I'm alone in being a collector of things that are important to me. It seems to be something that's, you know, people get quite passionate about, whether it be books. I know I'm actually collecting books as well now. So, you know, I have to sneak them past my wife and rack them quietly and hope that she doesn't notice. But She does the same with me with shoes and clothes, so there's good balance there. But yeah, it's vinyl. Just getting up and pulling the record out of a sleeve and putting it on a turntable is me kind of regressing to my youth, and I just relate to it. It makes me feel good. So I'm buying a lot of new music. I'm buying a lot of records that are sometimes they're £1. But they're just great records, and sometimes they're, way more expensive than that.
The ones you don't tell your wife how much they cost.
Well, yeah. I mean, the day she discovers Discogs and looks at how much I pay for records is going to be a pretty tough to deal with. Anyway, that's another subject.
Yeah. So, well, let's talk about your playlist choices now. So, this is the House Culture Perfect playlist. This is based on 5 themes. It's found on Spotify. Every one of our guests, the previous 69, have submitted tracks for 5 tracks for this playlist. I think it's well over 35 hours long. I think I checked the other day. You've given us your choices up front. I can remind you of them if you can't remember them off the top of your head. So as we go through,
I can remember, but remind me.
Yeah, of course. So we always start off with a Catalyst tune. Something that got you into dance music, opened your ears to up-tempo beats. You've chosen the Larry Levan remix of Class Action's Weekend, which is on Sleeping Bag, the brilliant label. This track for me, I only became aware of it kind of after the fact. We talked before the mics came on. For me, it was recognisable as a sample and sped up as a sample in a hardcore track. Okay. So it's one of those ones that I hear and I'm like, oh, this is where that sample came from. But just tell us about your experience with that tune.
Well, Class Action Weekend just ticks so many boxes for me. Sleeping Bag, iconic label. Mm-hmm. Larry Levan, probably, arguably, one of the greatest DJs ever. And at the Paradise Garage, probably one of the, and the reason he is probably regarded in such high esteem, and the club is revered as much as what it is because he, obviously, unfortunately, he died, and the club doesn't exist. As I said to you, I'm obsessed with New York in the 1980s. It was the club.
Yeah.
That record was played at the club. But, it was, I think it's a Leroy Burgess original, but on Freak. Yeah. So it was, the Class Action version is a cover version, probably made even more kind of famous by the fact that Todd Terry also covered it, and it works on all 3 of those different interpretations equally well.
Yeah.
But the Class Action, Christine Wilshire singing on it is amazing. There's a monologue. She's a diva in it. She's telling her man that she's just going to go out. I just like so much attitude in that record. Yeah. Slightly pre-house, garage anthem. Yeah. I could talk about that record for an hour. It's but the Larry Levan version just has so much more funk to it. I think that's probably why it's my preferred version.
Brilliant. Okay, we move on to a floor filler. You've already mentioned this tune. This is Heaven by The Vision. Why do you see that as a floor filler? You mentioned that you could play it stands alongside any disco record. Is that?
I think that a lot of the records that I've been involved with over the years are somebody else's vision and somebody else's creativity, i.e. we've licensed them. A label has released them. I've heard it out. I've become aware of it. We do a deal with. We made Heaven. Ben Westbeach and Con are 2 artists that we work with, and they came together with a concept. Again, I'd met Ben randomly in Bali, and he said, I've got this idea for a record, and he played me some demos. I really liked them. Conversation involved. Ultimately, he made Heaven. Written, Adriana Triani wrote and sang on the record. James Brown on backing vocals. you can play it in a house set, you can play it in a disco set. It stands up against classic disco records that were made, back in the day in the 80s. If you're an adventurous DJ, and I think the DJs aren't as adventurous as they need to be in these times, you can play that record. You will be surprised by the reaction. It connects with the audience. So it has house sensibilities, it has disco sensibilities, it has soul sensibilities. We heard it from the very genesis of it being an idea, and then to see that record come from being hypothetical to rocking the dance floor is just really fulfilling.
Yeah. Okay, so a sunsetter, a perfect track to soundtrack a sunset. You've chosen Beautiful Escape by Tom Misch.
I think music generally is a beautiful escape. If ever I'm having a down moment, or I need a lift, or reminiscing, or I can put on a record, I can just be taken somewhere. Whether you're reminiscing or just it's just something that you fall in love with, because it's a great piece of work, etc. So I think the title is pretty meaningful. Tom Misch is an amazing producer, and seems to be a kind of product of the new world where you don't necessarily need to have your records played on radio for them to be really popular. So I discovered Tom Misch in the same way as most people did, on Instagram or via Spotify playlists, etc. And the vocal and the song are it's just a great modern soul record. I don't think there's enough soul in dance music in these times, and he just nails it.
Brilliant. Okay, a tearjerker. I love this song so much. Home is Where the Heart Is by Bobby Womack.
So, Bobby Womack, Teddy Pendergrass, Curtis Mayfield, like probably my go-to singers, artist in terms of soul. Bobby Womack just has that kind of gruff, gritty vocal that he seems to pull from the depths of his stomach, and Home is Where the Heart is basically an upbeat love song, and so it's not really a tearjerker in terms of it's not a ballad. Most people associate ballads with records that are sorrowful and mournful and whatever, but he's just talking about his love for someone, and there's a line in it which I just, every time I hear it, and I've heard that record hundreds of times, and there's a line in it which basically goes, I might never become a millionaire, but as long as I've got your love, I don't care. Yeah. And it's just like that. Just look, I'm watering up just thinking about that now.
Yeah.
So and it's just euphoric. It's just like, yes, a modern soul. There's a northern soul scene, a modern soul scene. That record is a modern soul anthem.
Yeah. It's don't be frightened either. There's so many people we've interviewed about, and when we get to the tearjerker, music, it does bring that emotion out, and it totally does. Okay, so a last tune. It's the end of the night. The crowd are asking for one more. What do you play? You've chosen the Dimitri from Paris remix of "Thinking of You" by Sister Sledge. What can be said about that? I don't know.
Okay, so when I first DJed, the first time I ever got asked to DJ was a girl's birthday party. The girl's name was Sharon Hopkins, who I'd given a cassette to, and she said, "It's my birthday, will you DJ at my party?" I hired some decks, got a record box, put together some music, and played at a party. It was the beginning of my DJ career. The record I remember playing at that party, because it was an anthem on the soul scene at the time, was the 7-inch of Sister Sledge, Thinking of You. So it's personal to me because it's a record that I played the first time that I ever DJ'd. Dimitri just took it to another level. I mean, Kathy Sledge's vocal is unbelievable, and it's a cappella right at the beginning. It it commands attention. You put it on, everybody stops. And just
getting goosebumps.
Yeah, it's just like, and amazing production, chic, Nile Rodgers, Bernard Edwards production, classic disco record. Sentiment of the song, thinking of you and the things you do to me, applies not just to love, just to anyone that has a positive influence on your life, and it just connects. It just connects.
Wow, and God bless Sharon Hopkins as well. Look at what she created.
So, who I still speak to, by the way.
Oh, that's even better. Okay, so we've done everything we wanted to cover in the interview. This is the final question that we always ask, I guess, on the podcast. Obviously, this is the House Culture podcast. We are House Culture. What does the culture of house mean to you? What does the phrase house culture mean to you?
Togetherness. Breaking down barriers, the unification of different sexualities and races and classes on the dance floor. The fact that our mantra was, in our house you're all equal. I've met some amazing people, not necessarily on the dance floor, but on my travels to house gigs, or just going to an event or leaving an event, etc. It's just brought so much richness and knowledge and joy into my life.
Excellent place to end. Thank you very much for taking part.
Pleasure, absolute pleasure.